I am in Shenyang, and not far from here in a city called Dalian, a man named Genrikh Lushkov was last seen in 1945. What happened to him was a mystery. But anyway, he was a Soviet officer, a high-ranking Soviet officer, who defected to the Japanese shortly before the war. In fact, he brought a great deal of information about Soviet troop presence to the Japanese, and it's believed that because he said that they had so many troops there, that in fact stopped the Japanese from invading Russia. Lushkov apparently remained a socialist throughout this time. He only really defected because of the purges in Soviet Russia, but he in fact took part in many of the purges. However, most of the Russians who came here to Manchuria were immigrants after the Russian Civil War, so many of them were anti-Bolshevik, and as such in the 20s they were inspired by Italian fascism, and they set up fascist parties in the 20s, and by 1931 the Russian Fascist Party was established with their headquarters in Harbin in the north, and this was around the same time that Japan invaded. And as a little interesting tidbit, when some of the Russians first came to China, they wrote profanity on Buddha statues, ancient Buddha statues, in the Mogao caves. But anyway, here in Manchuria, they flew the swastika outside their headquarters in Harbin, they wore black shirts, set up youth leagues, and apparently had over 10,000 members. Of course, this wasn't the only Russian fascist party abroad. For instance, you had a man named von Syatsky set up the All-Russian Fascist Organization in the United States. And despite Japan's attempts to merge the two groups, they had one major disagreement. Von Syatsky was not an anti-Semite. During the war, the fascists here in China tried to join the fight against the Soviets, but with Japan occupied elsewhere, they could only really engage in minor sabotage, and it wasn't particularly effective. And once the war was over, most of them were killed. And this was even after some of the leaders wrote letters of praise to Stalin, mainly just trying to get out of their execution. But many Russian emigres also settled in Shanghai, and a man named Vedelenko gave a detailed report of the community's life there. For instance, he said that they were expecting many higher-ranking officers like Marshal Blucher to join the fight against the communists. But the purges killed Blucher and the community's hope at large. He also said that before the war, the Americans and French helped the community a lot, but the British sort of just gave them the cold shoulder. And he said that they refused to join in the fight alongside the Japanese against the Chinese, and he was a bit disappointed because many Russians didn't join the organization, and over time many of them became drunks and prostitutes. But over time he, like many of the Russians in Shanghai and like here in Manchuria, became disillusioned with fascism. Now there's a few reasons why this was, but for instance one of them was their dealings with the Japanese, and also seeing them go into battle so ill-equipped and hearing about them losing to the Americans. But one of the main reasons why was they heard reports of Hitler essentially trying to wipe out the Slavs. Before the war they just assumed Hitler was going to oust the communists and install a nationalist government, but once it became clear that he had other motives, they quickly sort of abandoned the idea of fascism.